Hi class. Last video covered what we called the introduction to argument and got pretty much everything done I wanted to say about the inference versus content, so probably 4 videos have become 3, so disregard that part of the syllabus there. But let's briefly review what we talked about last time. When we're talking about arguments, we're talking about trying to establish a conclusion. Now, in order to even have a chance of establishing a conclusion, we would have to do 2 things. We would have to present claims to fact, and we would have to try to show that those facts lead to some further fact. And so every argument must do these 2 things. It must make a factual claim and an inferential claim. And as a result, it must do both of those well in order to be successful. And that's something that people miss quite often. I emphasized last time that people still think bad inferences can make good arguments. They absolutely cannot. So we're starting to shift towards an ability to evaluate arguments. We are not there yet. We're building towards it. So remember, one thing I emphasized last time is all of this is what is true of any argument. And so we're really not separating good arguments from bad arguments yet. We are still positioning ourselves to be able to do so with the next video. And there's one last component we have to do before we can start evaluating it all. And this is a trickier distinction, so there's a couple of handouts online to help you make it. And this is the distinction between deduction and induction. Now, let me say a few things about why this distinction matters. Start with just a general, one of those fun philosophical claims you were probably hoping to get out of the class. Here's something you may have never realized before. Any evaluation, period, anything you are evaluating, if you are using an evaluative term, that evaluation is relative to kind, the kind of thing you are evaluating. So, for instance, if I asked you, is 6 foot 4 inches tall? Tall is an evaluative term, so the only correct answer would be depends on the kind of thing. Is 6 feet 4 inches tall for a human? Yes. Is it tall for a tree? No. Is it tall for an ant? Start running. But the point is, we cannot evaluate unless we know the kind of thing we are evaluating. Very similarly, I'm willing to bet most of you want me to evaluate your exams based on the kind of thing they are. The exams of an introductory course. If you would like, I am happy to evaluate them as if they were the exams of a graduate level course. Being a little cute there, but you can see the difference. All evaluation is relative to kind. So, circling back to arguments, deduction and induction are 2 kinds of inference, which means as such, they are evaluated differently. And so before we can start evaluating, we have to know the difference between deduction and induction. So it's tricky and it's not something a lot of people are used to, so we're going to make the distinction in several different ways and hopefully practice on the discussion boards in order to help us do that. But starting very, very broadly, this is a distinction in the kinds of inference. There's only 2 kinds of inference. Every inferential claim must be deductive or inductive. And the distinction is really about how well the premises are supposed to, because we're still using the hypotheticals here, how well is it supposed to establish the conclusion? Put very briefly, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time expanding afterwards, deductive arguments, the inferential claim is a claim of logical certainty. That is, the premises are intended to make the conclusion logically certain. But remember, that's about the inference. It's not that the conclusion is logically certain, it's the conclusion follows from the premises with logical certainty. So everything else is inductive. Inductive arguments, the inferential claim is a claim of probability or likelihood. And so well, let's say a little more about logical certainty first, because that's something you might not be familiar with. Logical certainty is something weird. First of all, in real life, you never encounter it. Logical certainty is reserved for usually mathematics and logic. So here's a definition of logical certainty. Something is logically certain if it's inconceivably false. So if an inference is logically certain, that means I cannot even imagine, I cannot form an image in my head of the conclusion not following from the premises. So notice this doesn't say I can't imagine the conclusion being false. It's saying I can't imagine the conclusion not following from the premises. Or, put another way, I cannot imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false. Those are different. So, for reasons we'll talk about in a little while, sorry, it's really hot in my office, that's why I'm twitchy. For reasons we'll talk about in a while, the argument I gave in the last video, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that's a deductive argument. In fact, it's a successful deductive argument. And notice, let's apply what I just said about conclusions and inferences to that example. So we don't just ask, is the conclusion logically certain? Because of course it's not. I'd say, well, can I conceive of or imagine Socrates not being mortal? Yeah, sure. But that's not the claim. The claim is that the inference is logically certain. The inference is like 2 plus 2 is 4. So what I ask is, can I conceive it being true that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, and yet somehow not conceive Socrates being mortal? That's what's impossible. So if you had trouble with that one, maybe use another inference. Remember, the other inference I had was, or a similar one, how about Mickey is over 6 feet tall, therefore Mickey is over 5 feet tall. That's another deductively certain inference. Can you conceive of Mickey not being over 5 feet tall? Yeah, sure. But that's not what's at stake. The question is, can I conceive of it being true that Mickey is over 6 feet tall, but it being false that Mickey is over 5 feet tall? That's the one that's inconceivable because it follows with certainty that if Mickey is over 6 feet tall, Mickey is over 5 feet tall. So that's what the claim is. And again, I'm going to keep using the word claim because we haven't got to evaluation yet. Arguments will often intend logical certainty, but not actually achieve it. So, we are not talking evaluation, we are talking the claim. So the claim of a deductive argument is that the conclusion follows from the premises with logical certainty. The claim of an inductive argument is that the conclusion does follow from the premises, but not with logical certainty, so with probability, etc. All right, so we're going to keep working on this distinction, and I like to start with an example. Imagine I gave the following argument. The sun has risen every day for the past billion years. Our current understanding of the laws of astrophysics are probably accurate, and they say that the sun will rise tomorrow. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. So first of all, connect this with what I said about arguments last time. If someone asks me why I believe the sun will rise tomorrow, what I just said would probably be my answer, and that shows that arguments are really a connection for why should I believe the conclusion. But ask yourself this question. Is that argument deductive or inductive? What I need to ask is, can I imagine the premises being true, not hard since the premises are true, and the conclusion being false? So that is, can I imagine a situation where everything I just said is true, and yet the sun does not rise tomorrow? Can you even form an image in your head of that? And I'll say, well, absolutely. Here's a couple of examples. A global killing meteor from the 95% of the sky that we don't have funding to monitor wipes out the Earth tonight. No sunrise tomorrow. Or the sun goes red giant and consumes Mercury, Venus, and Earth. No sunrise tomorrow. Or some sort of religious event, end of the world type thing. No sunrise tomorrow. So, what does this teach us? It teaches us that our belief that the sun will rise tomorrow is not logically certain, which means the argument supporting it is an inductive argument. And that should teach us several other things, and that's why I like to use this example. The first thing it should teach us is there's nothing wrong with induction. You do nothing wrong in believing that the sun will rise tomorrow, and you definitely do something wrong if you don't believe it. So, logical certainty is not required for belief. That is a big misconception that a lot of people have. We don't need logical certainty for belief, which is good because we almost never have it. Second thing, though, it teaches us is deductive arguments are really, really rare. You almost never encounter them in real life. They tend to be by real life I mean outside in the world. They tend to be in mathematics, they tend to be in philosophy, and that's about it. That doesn't mean they're not useful, but it helps us identify that, well, if we're giving real-world arguments, such as one that the sun will rise tomorrow, probably going to be inductive. The third thing it should teach us, and this is not a bad thing at all, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that 99.99999% of all of your beliefs are inductively justified. So, a good example, take an everyday belief you have, such as if I believe that my car will start the next time I try to start it. That's a belief. If you want to justify that belief, I'll say, give me an argument. You'll give an argument, and you'll mention a bunch of true things about how it started in the past, how nothing strange has happened, how it has gas and oil and all that stuff. And yet, can you imagine all of that being true and your car not starting? Sure. So your belief that your car will start is inductive. Here's a couple more examples to really bend your noodle. Your belief that there was such a person as Abraham Lincoln will be grounded inductively. Relatedly, your belief that this person is Mickey Lorkowski, or even that your parents are who they say they are, inductively held. Your belief that your arm is not going to fall off and turn into a flying chinchilla in the next 10 minutes will be justified by an inductive argument the vast majority of the time. So, most of our beliefs are inductively justified, and that's fine. Perfectly fine. Roughly anything to do with cause and effect, which is to say anything to do with the sciences, history, etc., inductively held beliefs, inductive arguments. I say all of this for a couple of reasons. One, get rid of your hopes and desires for logical certainty because you really, really, really don't need them, which is good because most of the time you don't have them. But the other reason I'm mentioning all this is to really kind of start cementing this distinction between deduction and induction. If it sounds like something a normal human being would say, or that you've said before in the past, probably not deductive. So let's talk about the deductive argument forms and the inductive argument forms. These are all listed in the argument summary sheet, but before you get too worried, let me say this. You're not responsible for any of these forms on the exam. Instead, I'm giving these as examples so you kind of start to know what deductive arguments sound like and look like. So, what unites all deductive arguments? They are all, in a sense, arguments from definition. They follow just from the definitions of the words used and just very formal things about logic. So, for instance, a classic argument from definition, if I said, Mickey is not a bachelor, therefore Mickey is married. It just follows from the meaning of the word bachelor. It follows from the definition. That would be a deductive inference. And notice nobody talks like that. But there's some kind of more specific kinds of inference that are still based on definition. So let's start with the two I gave. Mickey is over 6 feet tall, therefore Mickey is over 5 feet tall. That's what we call an argument from math. It just follows from the definition of mathematical terms that 6 is greater than 5, and therefore that's a good inference. So arguments from math, deductive, don't hear people talking like that. The other one I gave, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that is what's sometimes called a categorical argument. Its conclusion is just supposed to follow from the definitions of all, no, and some. And we'll return to those because they're pretty easy to check the inference for. And so we've got examples in that way. But they follow from a definition. Once more, you usually don't hear people talking like that, but there's actually some really neat ways to use those, and one of the reasons why deduction is still valuable. You know, in case I've turned you off to deduction too much, let me give an example of where exactly that is valuable. Here's an argument I've heard before. Homosexuals should not be allowed to marry because they can't have kids. Well, as stated, of course, that inference is a bad inference because it would be missing a premise. What premise would you need to make the inference a good one? You would need to add the claim, no marriages that cannot have children should be recognized. That's the only way to make the conclusion follow. But of course, no one wants to accept that premise because it's garbage and it's bullshit. Are you saying someone who's had a hysterectomy shouldn't be allowed to get married? Are you saying that people who are over 50 shouldn't be allowed to get married? Well, no, of course not. And so one of the values of deduction is that little exercise I just gave. Well, if I want to know whether that's a good inference, I have to ask, what's the missing premise that actually allows you to infer the conclusion? Missing premise in that way is called an enthymeme, not that you need to know that. And once we identify it, we can tell whether that's a good argument or not. In that case, it's not, because once we fill in the missing premise, it's junk. In the critical thinking class, we do a lot more with those. The only reason I'm mentioning it now, it tells us how and why deduction can still be useful in real life. All right, two other deductive argument forms I'll mention. Disjunctive. It's just supposed to follow from the meaning of or either or. I have to take either mathematics or formal logic to fulfill my quantitative reasoning requirement. I don't want to take mathematics, therefore I'll take formal logic. Just from either or. Last one is a hypothetical. It's supposed to follow from if-thens. If A, then B. Just supposed to follow from the definition of if A, then B. So, for instance, if you're in Ohio, you're in the U.S. I'm in Ohio, therefore I'm in the U.S. Would be a hypothetical deductive argument. So, those are those are the only deductive argument types. That's the reason I give you the whole list. If it's not definition, argument from math, categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive, it's not a deductive argument. And notice all of those, just because it mentions the word or doesn't make it deductive. The conclusion has to follow from the definition of or. By contrast, let's talk about the inductive argument forms. What unites all of these? They all have something to do with cause and effect. So just like all deductive arguments, you could kind of reduce to specialized arguments from the definition. All of the inductive arguments you can reduce to specialized applications of cause and effect. So first of all, you can just leave it at cause and effect. So I come home and my cookies are missing and there's crumbs on the floor and my dog has a guilty look on his face. Therefore, my dog ate them. Is a simple, what they call a causal inference. I see the effect and I infer the cause. So all inductive arguments are specialized versions of that. So what are these other types? Again, you're not required to know this list. I'm mentioning those just because it helps us make the distinction you are responsible for. You are responsible for making the distinction between induction and deduction, so if the examples help, great. Let's start with, there's a couple of reasons, and you really start to encounter inductive arguments as soon as someone asks you to justify a belief. Well, why do you believe your car will start? Roughly speaking, the answer is it started in the past and I have no reason to think differently. If the inference is that the future will resemble the past, that is an inductive argument form called a prediction. So in all predictions, we use, it relies on the inference that the future will be similar to the past. That's implicitly about cause and effect, which means it's less than logically certain. Very similarly, if I made a prediction about the Indians game tonight, based on their past performance, that would be inductive. So lots and lots of predictions. We use them all the time. And I mentioned anything to do with the sciences is inductive. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose I'm inferring whether when I drop this coaster, it will fall. You probably have never thought of that before, but if you had to articulate why you believed it would fall, your argument would probably end up being a prediction having to do with, well, gravity's worked in the past, therefore it'll continue to work. So those are predictions. By contrast, there's an argument form called a generalization. So a generalization is where you go from kind of a whole to a sample, or vice versa. Now notice generalizations are different than categorical arguments, because we don't go, if we're going all to one, deductive. If we're going, for instance, most to one, inductive. So if I said, well, vast majority of humans are under 7 feet tall, therefore this student in the class is under 7 feet tall. It's inductive because it's based on a most. So there's lots of different types of generalizations, but anything to do with statistics is going to be a generalization. The difference between generalization and prediction, again, not that you need to get into this too deeply, prediction has to have a time component. It has to go from past to future. Generalization doesn't. It goes from a sample to an individual, or number of individuals to a whole. So very similarly, if I said, well, the first 5 exams I graded were all Fs, therefore everybody failed. That would be a generalization too. I'm going from individuals to generalize about the whole. But it's inductive. By contrast, here's another inductive form, analogy. So analogies are something we'll return to later in the semester, but in an analogy, it's actually one of our most used inductive forms, but it never gets enough attention. In an analogy, we use known similarities to infer further similarities. So for instance, if I wanted to know how this class was going to do on exam 1, well, I can't make a prediction because you haven't taken exam 1 before, so I can't use the past. But what I can use is an analog. I could say, well, wait a minute, last semester's class is similar to this one in important ways. They did this well on the exam, therefore this class will do this well on the exam. That would be an analogy. Or think about how we're testing virus stuff right now for vaccines. Well, the vaccine works, probably not as much on vaccines, but a lot of blood and heart stuff gets tested on rats because they have similar circulatory systems. So the drug improved rats' cholesterol. Rats and humans have similar cholesterol issues, therefore the drug will improve humans. That's an analogy. So arguments from analogy, always inductive. And lastly, there's 2 interesting ones that we use all the time and never stop to think about. There's a lot of stuff we believe because other people tell us. So, but this gets split into 2 kinds, and we'll return to some of them when we get into the apology, the next philosophical reading, and the Crida. So, boy, I realize my examples aren't the best for video, but if I was standing in a room with no windows in a class, and somebody walked in, and I said, what's the weather like? And they say it's raining, I would believe it was raining. And I would believe it because that person told me, and I have no reason to think they're lying. That is a little different than a case where If instead of is it raining today, my question is it going to be raining 3 days from now? What's the difference between those two cases? The first case is anyone in the right position could tell you. And the second case, only an expert could tell you. The first kind are what are called arguments from signs. It could be a literal sign. For instance, my belief that this is room 103 comes from the fact that somebody stuck a room 103 sign on it. But those are signs. What's indicative of arguments from signs, you're just basically acting on the inference that I will assume people will be honest if they're qualified, and I have no reason to think they're lying. Lots and lots and lots of beliefs are based on that. And again, in most situations, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm perfectly reasonable to believe it's raining. What situations might I not be? If it's August and instead they say it's snowing, I'm more likely to believe they're having fun with me. By contrast, the what's it like 3 days from now, there I'm relying on believing what an expert says about it. And so when I'm relying on expertise, that's called an argument from authority. Now, there's this ugly kind of blurring that happens here because, first of all, we're talking about authority not in the sense of power, but in the sense of knowledge. So, I'm an authority in some sense, not because I have power, but because I have a certain type of specialized knowledge. So this anti-authority bleh stuff that you might hear from teenage angst and what have you, that's not the kind of thing that undermines this type of argument, and I wish our country realized that a little better. But also remember it's induction. There's nothing wrong with induction. You should believe what authorities tell you. That is, authorities and knowledge most of the time. If you don't believe that, you actually shouldn't be in college because everything the professor tells you is ultimately coming from authority. And so by entering into higher education, you recognize that there are people who are experts in their fields, who know this stuff, and therefore you should be in a position to believe it. So that's the last kind of inductive argument. I've run this video a little longer than I intended, but again, that's because we're combining a few things. So let's take away all the highlights. One, just functionally, what you are responsible for in the discussions on the exam, you are responsible for being able to identify whether an argument is deductive or inductive. That's it. How might we do that? A couple ways. First of all, if you just kind of get the concept of logical certainty, you can make that distinction. But two, remember the very general distinction I gave? Well, is the conclusion supposed to follow from definitions and form, deductive, or cause and effect in the sciences, inductive? A third way we can make that distinction, you have the entire list of all the deductive forms and all the inductive forms. So if I recognize that argument as an analogy, for instance, I know it's inductive. Lastly, there's kind of this cutesy one, but it is helpful sometimes that, well, if it sounds like something you might say in normal discourse, it's very likely inductive. So why do we need to know this? Because we have to know what type of inference is being made before we evaluate. And so our next step is going to be finally to get to evaluation, and then we'll turn to practice. See you next time.